Welcome, everyone. Welcome everyone to the last lecture series hosted by our very own Humanities Center and the Judy Lewis Lowe Alcala Chapter of Mortar Board. My name is Oscar Muniz, a member as well as alumni liaison for Mortar Board. So for those of you who don't know, the last lecture series is a biannual event hosted by Mortar Board. In this event, Mortar Board selects a professor from the USD community to give a lecture as if it was their last. So this semester, we have the absolute privilege to have Dr. Casey Dominguez, in which she'll giving from the political science department, and she'll be giving her last lecture on democracy and the democratic citizenship. I had the absolute pleasure to take my first political science class with Dr. Dominguez over here, and that was ultimately inspired me to declare my major as political science. So honestly, thank you so much, Dr. Dominguez. You're actually one of the main reasons I'm here, so thank you so much. And I hope I obtain even a small portion of your intelligence in my lifetime, just to put it simply. And so please, if you could help me in giving a warm welcome to the brilliant person that is Dr. Casey Dominguez.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Oscar, and we're so glad that you did decide to become a political science major. And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. So I will begin by not using this. Hold on a second. There. No. Never mind. Okay. I would begin by acknowledging the origins of the last lecture series in a professor at Carnegie Mellon about 15 years ago who was diagnosed with a terminal illness and who was then gave a very famous last lecture. And so I just want to acknowledge that it's an honor to be part of that tradition, and also just to say I'm only halfway through my career, very healthy. This is not my last lecture. I will see some of you on tomorrow morning. But that said, I think the point of this lecture series is to ask professors to say something more than what they would usually say, and to imagine if this was the last time that you got to speak to students, what would you say? And so I'm going to try to honor that. And I'll do that by sort of going through a little bit. I'll start with a little bit of an outline. I'm going to talk about democracy today, and I'll do with a little bit of an introduction about myself and why I care about democracy and American democracy specifically. And then I'll define some terms for you. I'll talk about what democracy is and why I think you should care about it. And then I'm going to ask you to do what your democracy needs from you. And so I'm going to give you some advice as if it were my last opportunity to tell you what you need to do to be a good democratic citizen. So we'll begin with me. Who am I and why do I care about democracy? Well, like many of us, I have many identities. I am a professor, I'm a political scientist. I'm very proud to be a political scientist. We are the coolest people. Political science professors are smart and interesting and fun to be around, and you should want to be one. And I'm very lucky to be a political scientist and welcome my political science colleagues here. I'm also, however, a mom. I'm a Girl Scout mom. I have 2 daughters. I bake bread as an amateur. I eat chocolate as a professional. And as a political scientist, I've written about American political parties, American elections. I've edited 2 books on the presidential nomination process, and I wrote a book about the constitutional development of the Commander-in-Chief Clause. So that's a little bit about me and what I do and some of the ways that I describe myself today. But let me talk a little bit about why I care about American democracy. And I'm going to start from a place that's a little unusual, I think. It's not something that you're going to hear from professors or academics most of the time. But I come to love American democracy because I just love America. I'm like a super patriotic person, and that's not something you're going to hear from a lot of academics, but it's really, that is who I am. I've lived in lots of places. I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I grew up in Austin, Texas. My parents, brothers and sisters lived on the East Coast. We spent our summers driving around the was actually an AI-generated station wagon, but ours was blue, and we spent our summers driving around the United States. And it's a beautiful country with lots of amazing people in it. And I've driven the 10 from the West Coast to the East Coast, through the deserts and the swamps. I've driven the 80 across the middle of the United States, broken down in a very old car in the middle of Iowa, and been helped out by some nice people. I've taken a train across the country. I've driven the 90 across the northern United States. I've been to Yellowstone. I've been to Glacier National Park and Olympic National Park, and lots of others. I've been to Fenway Park. I've been to the Camden Yards. I've been to baseball parks all over the country. I love baseball. I love apple pie. What you see there is actually the real image of the apple pies that we made for our wedding when we decided to have apple pie instead of cake, because that's just how America I am. And this is a very rare photo of me playing a sport when I was 10. So I was a Cardinal, and my dad was the coach. And so, I think, people travel, USD people travel abroad, it's great. Travel the world, go to Florence, it's lovely. But you should also go to Chicago if you haven't been. And you should also go to the Petrified Forest, and you should also go to the Grand Canyon and, enjoy the United States and get to know some of the people who are here. Okay, so that's sort of what got me into America. Let me talk about democracy. So for those of you who aren't political science students, I'll give just a little bit of a definition and a little bit of a lecture tonight about democracy and what it is. So democracy is, first of all, a system of government that's characterized by the rule of law. And the rule of law, it means that the laws are written down in advance, and it is expected that everyone follow them because they are known, they are public, and some autocrat doesn't just make it up on the spot. Democracy is, perhaps you're familiar with this part, a system of government in which rulers are accountable to the public through competitive elections. And that competitive elections part may be the most important part, but it's not the only part of how to define a democracy. And a democracy is also characterized by citizens enjoying broad liberties. So that's a sketchy definition, and we'll get into a little bit more detail. What's so great about it? You'll hear people say democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others, and yeah, that's good. That's a good definition. But I think there's more to say about it than that. So let's just imagine, use a little bit of perspective here. 1,000,000 years ago, we were eating bugs off of each other's fur. 100,000 years ago, we were living in caves. Not so long ago, most people were ruled by autocrats in the world. And we get to live in a country where we get to live under this totally crazy and radical idea that we, the monkeys, the barely evolved chimpanzees, can govern ourselves and take turns doing so, even though we don't like each other and we have lots of different ideas about what to do. And it's a crazy idea, but it's a really cool one. I think another thing democracy has going for it is that it is really fundamentally rooted in ideas about human equality. The whole Thomas Paine's common sense was the kings aren't any better than us. And it's, that's, for its time, it was a radical idea. And for now, of course, we look at that Declaration of Independence and we read it differently, for sure, than they read it at the time. But the ideas that founded this country remain great ideas. From the Declaration of Independence, you probably know this sing along if you want. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. There's a lot to unpack there, and I'm not going to, but just to highlight a couple of things. Equality among all people, that government should give us the right to live our lives and construct our own happiness the way that we want to. These are radical ideas, and they're worth cherishing. Let's talk about that freedom idea for a second here. Freedom means whatever there's lots of different definitions of freedom. There are positive freedoms, there are negative freedoms. Again, there's whole classes on these subjects, and I'm just going to say a few words about it. But think about what freedom means to you. And I'll share with you a statement about one of the things that freedom means to me. This is from the U.S. Supreme Court case in Griswold versus Connecticut, where the court said that the government cannot, consistently with the spirit of our First Amendment, contract the spectrum of available knowledge. The right of freedom of speech and press includes not only the right to utter or print, but the right to distribute, the right to receive, the right to read, and the freedom of inquiry, thought, and the freedom to teach. And that's what we do here. And this is that we have the freedom to do this, and it's not something that people have in other countries where you can just walk around dissing the people who are in charge and talking about how your country has made lots of mistakes. Like, that's something that we can do here, and that's not something that's guaranteed. That's something that we get to benefit from, and it's something that we should not take for granted. I'll throw some other ideas out there. Again, feel free to think of your own reasons, what might be so great about democracy. But for my money, America is a work in progress. And we should cherish it, and we should work to make it better because other people have worked to make it better for us. So, the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, they took big risks to try to get representation that they thought they deserved. The people who fought the Civil War and fought to emancipate enslaved people and fought to end slavery as an institution took big risks. Lots of people died to try to end something that was manifestly unjust. And they knew it, and they fought for it, and they gave that to us. I don't know if we still remember this, but the Nazis were really the bad guys. and the United States defeated the Nazis. And those boys, they jumped off of those ships trying to storm the beaches of Normandy, and that was a very brave thing to do. And bravery takes lots of forms, right? There were people who fought to get rid of child labor laws, fought to give women the right to vote, fought for various kinds of worker protections, fought to end Jim Crow and guarantee civil rights and voting rights and integrated schools and an integrated society. And people worked for that. So, but democracy's hard, right? It's a hard project to be a part of. And I'll throw another Poli-Sci 101 quote up here for you. Whoa, that font is not the way it looked on my computer. But if this is James Madison. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So the message here in modern English is we have to have government that protects us and protects our securities, and it has to give us the order that we crave, or we won't want it anymore. It has to give us freedom and security and order, but government can be bad too, and we also have to have controls on government so that it does not oppress the people, and that is a hard balance to try to put together. And I just want to throw up an acknowledgement here that democracies can do terrible things, right? Just because it has some good stuff to speak for it does not mean that democracy does not enslave people and does not intern people and does not murder people and does not sterilize people and does not incarcerate people for no reason. Democracies can be very tyrannical and terrible. They also don't last. Democracies are fragile. There's a whole field of study devoted to how democracies deconsolidate or fall apart or backslide. And that's also something that Americans need to think about. Democracy doesn't have to be good, and it doesn't have to be forever. So what does political science know about how to produce and sustain democracy that is not just any democracy, but a democracy that's oriented toward the public good? Well, one thing you need is certain types of government institutions. I'll talk about each of these in turn. And the second thing you need is a healthy civil society. And another thing you need is democratic social norms. It's not just you can put a constitution on a piece of paper and there you go, you got a democracy. It's not like that. It's actually a careful balance to try to make sure that you have a government that listens to the people but doesn't let the people decide to do bad things. So in terms of democratic institutions, the people who study democracies around the world find that it's one of the basic definitions, if you're going to compare countries to each other and find that some are democratic and some are not, lawmaking power has to be vested in elected officials. That's kind of basic, right? We have to elect people to make the laws. But that means specifically that the military doesn't make the laws and the bureaucrats don't make the laws. The laws are made by people who are elected by the voters. Strong legislative bodies are super important here. Putting too much power in the hands of the executive doesn't always work out very well. You also have to have some kinds of checks and balances, right? Democratic institutions, part of the deal is that the people who are in power are also citizens. We elect citizens from among ourselves to govern us for a period of time, and then they leave. And they don't, and they have to acknowledge the laws, and they have to follow the laws, and they have to not see themselves as above the law. And one of the ways that you can do that institutionally is by having judges and prosecutors that are independent of the people in power. And then, of course, you got to have voting, right? You have to have clear rules about who gets to be in power, and that means enforceable election laws and free and fair democratic elections. So that's kind of what you think, right? You got to have elected officials that can make laws in legislatures. You got to have some judges. You got to have elections. That said, it turns out that democracy can take lots of different forms. Like in our democracy, the voters, we elect members of the House, we elect members of the Senate, we elect the president separately, and then they have to all agree on the bills that become laws, right? Everybody remembers that? But that's not the only way democracy can look. You don't have to have a legislative and an executive branch that are separate from each other. The legislative branch can choose the executive. That's a parliamentary system. That works just fine. That the checks and balances in our constitutional system aren't a prerequisite. There's lots of other ways that democracies can differ from each other too. We use a plurality rule. You get one more vote than the other guy, you get to hold office, even if we have to have a coin flip to decide it. But you could also say, oh, look, if whatever percentage of the votes your party gets, you get that percentage of the seats in the parliament. There are lots of countries that do it that way, and that's fine too. We have a two-party system. You don't have to have a two-party system. You can have a democracy with a four-party system or a five-party system or a nine-party system, or you can have an unlimited number of parties. We appoint our federal judges for life. You don't have to. Other democracies appoint judges to fixed terms or sometimes even elect them, as we do in many of the states. In California, we get to vote on bills that can become laws through referendums and initiatives, but you don't have to. Lots of places don't have that as part of their constitutional system. So democracy turns out to be not a simple formula, not just, well, you have to have this institution and these are exactly the rules that have to be followed. It's not quite that simple. You have to have lawmaking power in the legislature. You have to have rulers not being above the law. There has to be some kind of checks and balances and accountability for the people in power. And there has to be vertical accountability from the public, right? There have to be free and fair elections. But besides that, they can look a lot of different ways. And no matter what it looks like, that's not enough. If you have those rules on paper, that does not mean that you automatically get to have democracy. Because you need some other things as well. People who study comparative politics, especially, talk a lot about civil society. But civil society is important everywhere, including in the United States. Civil society is non-governmental institutions. Universities, churches, charities, sports leagues, places where PTAs, the Girl Scouts, organizations that allow people to get together democratically, organize themselves and solve some problems, and also generate information to tell the public about what's going on in their communities, and also to maintain alternative sources of information and authority that are not controlled by the government. Among the institutions in civil society, the most important institution is the free press. for pretty obvious reasons. If the public doesn't know what's wrong in society and what's wrong with the government, they will not be able to vote to fix it. And so the press is super important at being able to communicate, to do the research and communicate to the public about what's going on in the world and what's going on with their government. And like, the government will tell you the good stuff. That's not the problem, right? The press tells us when the government is doing stuff wrong. And to be healthy, it needs to be insulated outside of government, protected from government interference. So now we got some institutions inside government, institutions outside government, but then there's some more rules that have to be followed, both by the people who hold power, the politicians, and by the rest of us. So let's talk about social norms. Politicians and other political elites have to follow certain social norms if you're going to have a democracy and maintain it over the long term. The first thing they have to do is they have to tolerate each other. They have to be willing to take turns holding power. They have to be willing to acknowledge that the other political party is not the enemy. The other political party are just the competitors, right? The loyal opposition, good Americans who disagree with us about stuff. Elites have to acknowledge that. If they start to say, no, the other side is the enemy, bad things can happen. And one of the restraints that people in elected office have to use is they have to control themselves and exercise what's called forbearance in power. That means that when you get power through democratic elections, you cannot use that power to rig the system against your political opponents. If you do that, you don't get to be a democracy for very much longer. So elites have to restrain themselves. And they also have to be committed to the rule of law. They have to be intolerant of corruption, even in their friends. Even when their fellow members of their political party are breaking the rules and doing things and breaking the law and being corrupt and taking bribes and doing other bad things, like, you gotta rat them out, right? You gotta turn them in. Being a political ally doesn't mean that you have to excuse people who are violating the law. Elites in healthy democracies are intolerant of corruption and committed themselves to the rule of law and to following the law even when other people aren't looking. So that's the elites. We have to expect them to live up to these standards, and they have to do it on their own even when we're not looking. What about us? What are the norms that are expected of us? We also have to follow rules even when people aren't looking, right? We have to be, follow the basic social contract. We have to be law-abiding, responsible citizens. Hopefully, we're socialized well enough to accomplish that. But then we also have to do some hard things. We have to accept political equality and reject dehumanization. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but basically think about what happens to groups in society once people start talking about them like they're vermin, like they're subhuman, like they don't deserve political equality, they don't deserve to be members of the political community. Very bad things happen in that situation. That's where you get the Holocaust. That's where you get enslavement. That's where you get the denial of women's right to own property and vote and be members of a political community, right? It's through dehumanization. You can't have that. Like, when our Constitution was written, people did that. But if we want the words of the Declaration of Independence to mean what we want them to mean today, and we want them to mean that there are human rights for everybody, then we have to actively do that, right? We have to reject dehumanization and political inequality and arguments that outgroups and people that we don't like don't deserve to be here. We also have to, as you might imagine, just participate in democracy, inform yourselves, vote, read newspapers. I'll say more about that later. Okay, so there's the lecture part. So basically, people who study democracy, and there's whole fields of study devoted to this, and how democracies have worked in history, and how they work around the world, and how they work in American history, and how do they work today. And it turns out that democracy is not just something on a piece of paper. It's a fragile balance that requires people to be responsible democratic citizens. And it is not a guarantee. And it is not something that lasts forever. And it is not something that you can just take for granted. So my argument, if this were in fact my last lecture and I was leaving for any number of reasons, which I am not, I would conclude with what I'm going to say next, which is you have to be part of this project. This is not just for grown-ups, and by the way, you are grown-ups. Hate to tell you, but there's nobody who's going to come and protect democracy. You have to do it yourself. Everybody has to be part of it. It's a group project of epic proportions, and if everybody doesn't do their part, everybody fails. Okay, so if I have convinced you that there is work to be done here to protect democracy and to make sure that it thrives in the future and delivers us good outcomes instead of bad outcomes, what can you do? And fortunately, the list is long. There are a lot of ways to protect democracy, and so pick the ones that you can do. Do some of them for sure, but pick the ones that you can do, and do your part. So let's start at the beginning, right? So the first necessary set of institutions are government institutions. So you're like, I'm not in government, I'm not a member of Congress. What can I do to protect democratic institutions? I think you should learn about them. And I say that as a person who's been teaching American politics for almost 20 years. And yeah, I think you ought to take a class in American politics if you haven't. And if you haven't taken one in a while, take another one and take another one. Because you should learn about how the system works for a couple of reasons. One is, if you learn about how it works, then you can participate effectively, right? You can figure out at what point should I be protesting in the streets? At what point should I be writing letters to my congressman? At what point should I be doing a tweet storm? Like what's useful? But you have to understand how the system works. And you kind of have to understand how it works, not just so you can be effective, but so that you can understand what politicians are telling you and when they're making stuff up, right? There's a lot of magical stories about what government can do or not do or what it's doing to you. And if you don't have any background, any framework in which to understand and process that information, then you're going to be lied to and you're not even going to know it. And that's magical stories about things that our government can do. My least favorite phrase in the English language is the president passed a law. Presidents don't pass laws, guys. They sign bills into law that Congress passes. And if we don't understand that, eventually presidents are going to have the ability to make law by themselves, and that's a bad thing. I'll get off my soapbox about that. But you also need to understand, like, people say, oh, you know what will solve everything? There's this one weird magic trick. If we just pass a constitutional amendment to get rid of Citizens United, everything will be great. Like, skip it with that stuff. Like, there are no one weird magical tricks that are going to solve all the problems with our democracy. And I promise you, overturning Citizens United is just not one of those. But you gotta learn a lot before you can come to those kinds of conclusions. And also, one more, a multi-party system would solve all our problems. Maybe. Madison and the framers thought our Constitution would solve all the problems. The progressives thought the initiative and the referendum and primary elections would solve all the problems. It might be the case that no institutional changes will solve all our problems. Doesn't mean don't try, doesn't mean there aren't ways to make our system better. Our system is not the best in the world by any means. But like, you gotta learn about it. Like there's some, we have agency here. We can make our constitutional system better, but not by listening to guys on TikTok. Something else you can do to support institutions is like take some trips around the country, go talk to people, talk to your relatives, right? Not just your close relatives, but your distant relatives. Like appreciate the diversity of this country and all of the different perspectives that people have in it. It's really hard for us to do stuff together. This is not an easy project that we're engaged in. But if you're in a little bubble where everybody agrees with you and you can't possibly imagine that everybody doesn't agree with you, then you do not appreciate the magnitude of the situation because people do not agree about most things. And being a good democratic citizen means trying. You don't have to agree. Promise me. I promise you, you do not have to agree with anything that somebody says that you don't like, but you should try to understand what they're saying. Here's another one for you. You got to hold politicians to high standards. We will get the government that we deserve and that we demand and that we ask for. And if you just say stuff like, oh, they're all corrupt, then they're all going to be corrupt. They're not all corrupt, guys. They don't all take bribes. They're not all in it for themselves. There are good people out there trying to make the world a better place, and they need our support. Be intolerant of corruption. Be skeptical of language that casts all politicians with the same brush. They don't all lie all the time. This is not, it's easy to say that. Because anytime you're communicating with the public, you say some things, you leave some things out. People don't really want to have a paragraph-long explanation. They want 3 words instead of 50. And so in that process, are some partial truths told? You bet. That's part of communicating as an adult in a democracy, and you should listen for that. But don't just assume everything they're saying is lies. This is lazy. And at the same time, so I'm saying, you should give politicians a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. Don't assume that they're all crooks. But on the other hand, don't hero worship them either. They're all super flawed human beings. All the great people in history have been super flawed human beings. We are all super flawed human beings. Do not put them on pedestals and expect them to solve all your problems, because they're egomaniacs and they thrive off of that. Don't give them that. Don't give them your worship. You're hiring them to do a job for you. You hire them because you think they'll do a good job. Check up to see if they do a good job. Keep an eye on them. But don't just assume the best and don't assume the worst. And for goodness sakes, don't be cynical. And we were just trying to think of a word that's more modern than cool, but I was born in the 70s, so I'm going to stick with cool. It's not cool to be cynical. That's how it comes across. It seems sophisticated. Oh, I understand, so I'm so cynical. Nonsense. Being cynical is a demobilizing. It asks you not to ask questions. It says you know best. You don't know best. Be curious. Don't be cynical. There's other things you can do. All right, so you can support our institutions. You can also support civil society. I do this by selling Girl Scout cookies, among other things. But civil society is vulnerable. When autocrats take over countries, pick your favorite country that's been taken over by an autocrat, a country that's experienced democratic backsliding, the first thing they do is they go after the institutions in civil society. They go after the free press and the universities, the churches, and the nonprofits. So don't let them do that. You have to be an active participant in your community. That means go join groups in person. You cannot join groups on your phone and have it be a democratic experience. You gotta go talk to people in person, and I know people suck, right? It's just not great to have to do group projects voluntarily in the real world as an adult, but that is part of being a democratic citizen. You have to go to try to plan a bake sale with somebody. You have to go to try to plan a picnic, a church picnic, a soccer picnic. Pick your civil society institution. You got to go be with people and try to do things with them as equals. And if you can work it out, try really hard to engage with people who are different than you. And of course, we're all different in many different ways. But one of the things that's wrong with America today is that we only interact with people who are really like us, especially socioeconomically, but also racially and also religiously, and also in terms of what we watch and what we wear and what we drive. Try to have some interactions in your life with people who are really different than you. And I'm not saying you have to debate the Second Amendment with people who are really different than you. I'm just saying have some low-stakes, positive interactions. Talk to people who are in line with you at a diner or at a concert. Talk to people who are, help somebody if they get a flat tire, right? Invite somebody to lunch with you if they're or talk to somebody if they're sitting alone, right? Have some nice social interactions with people who are not your friends. And the reason to do that is to build social trust, just to have little inconsequential interactions with people who are not like you, to let you know that not everybody is bad. Lots of people are good. And you might not get that impression if you are only watching the rage-filled social media or the something's going to kill you in your refrigerator local news. So in terms of supporting civil society, another thing you can do is you can support the free press. You know how much time it takes to research something. You have to write papers. If you write it in 10 minutes, it's not going to be good. If you take a really long time at it, it will be better. And information is just like that. You got to check things. You got to vet your sources. You got to look to multiple sources. Journalists do that for us. There's a whole set of institutions that are set up to do that kind of checking for us, but it takes somebody's time to do it, and it costs money to make. So once you have an income, not saying right now, you're students, but like if you have a little money, you should support the free press. And something else to keep in mind is that the press sells your eyeballs to advertisers, right? That's how NBC works, and that's how Fox works, and that's how the newspaper works. That's how the media has always worked, is that your attention is valuable. They want to get your attention so they can sell it. Social media is the same way, right? They want to hold your eyeballs on their app as long as possible so that they can sell advertising space to people who will try to sell you stuff. Anybody can get rich trying to capture your attention. This is the TikTok and the YouTube and the Instagram. All these people are trying to get rich by making you laugh or making you mad or telling you, or in my case, my Instagram is full of golden retrievers. But like, yeah, at the end of the day, I want to see some golden retrievers smiling at me. Sue me. And if you want to sell me some dresses while we're at it, okay. Like, these are bargains that we make. I'm not saying don't make those bargains, but like, understand that your attention is a commodity and that everybody is trying to create information just to get your attention. And that's not a trustworthy source, and it's not the same as journalism. In terms of practicing social norms, you guys are so lucky to be students at a liberal arts college, at a university, because being an informed citizen is just a lot easier when you have a college education. This is what the liberal arts teaches you. Hopefully, something that you learn in the course of your college education is, wow, there sure are a lot of people who know a lot of stuff, right? Wow, I didn't ever understand that there were that many parts of a cell, or that proteins were so complicated, or that cryptography had so much math, or that I didn't understand that about the history of, the Louisiana Purchase, or, whatever, right? There are people have really learned a lot of stuff out there. And so, again, the guy on YouTube may be one of those people who really knows a lot of stuff, but your professors really know a lot of stuff. Libraries have books full of people who have really studied stuff, and like, be curious, be intellectually humble, don't assume you know everything, and be a little skeptical of people who are trying to tell you about the history of the world in 30-second videos. Learn everything. Like, the world is a wondrous place, and we know so much about it, and there's so much we don't know about space, about our bodies, about the oceans, about the climate, about money, about financial markets, about other countries, about our own country. Like, there's so much to learn. You should learn stuff. It's fun. It's exciting. And the more you learn, the more you can interact that with how to be a good citizen, right? It certainly helps to understand a viral pandemic if you know something about exponential growth curves. And this is part of how being a liberal arts educated person helps you be a better citizen. And again, anytime we're thinking about, okay, I'm gonna go and be informed, I'm gonna teach myself stuff, like, just remember that your attention is a commodity. And when we're looking at the production of information to feed our ever shrinking attention spans, you should be a little skeptical of the motives of everybody who's trying to tell you something and hold your attention. Especially be wary of videos, posts, memes, podcasts, whatever, that make you feel really strong emotions, because that can manipulate you. And we're not very good at thinking when we're feeling strong emotions. And anger, outrage, we are more likely to share those pieces of information with others. And some of that information is packaged in such a way that it's not telling us the truth. It's trying to get our attention. It's trying to get other people's attention. It's trying to go viral. And if it feels like it's getting you to feel strong feelings, you should put the brakes on. Don't share that information. And also, hopefully, also in college, you're learning some great skills to be a critical thinker, to break down an argument and understand what is the evidence for that and what are the assumptions that are underlying that argument. And those are great skills. Use those skills. Don't be a good critical thinking citizen. And try not to be a conspiracy theorist, right? We all know people who think that the moon landing was faked. There's a lot of examples of that kind of thinking out there right now. Any story that starts with a they, a bad they that are doing things to us, let's use some proper nouns, and then we can have a conversation. Okay. Other things you can do to be a good democratic citizen, like obey the speed limit, pay your taxes, put trash in the trash can, obey and respect the law, especially when no one is looking, serve on a jury, register and vote in every election for every office. Do your research, vote in the primaries. You don't like the parties? Great. You don't have to like the parties. You know how to change the parties? You vote in the primaries. Run for office. But then you also gotta accept some ideas. You gotta accept the idea of political equality. You gotta accept the idea that everybody gets, if you get to vote, everybody gets to vote. And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. And we're all in this together, and everybody's a human being. And you cannot tolerate, no matter, even if it's a joke, right? It's not a joke. Dehumanizing language is not funny. It leads to terrible, violent outcomes. Do not tolerate it in your friends, or your family, or your social media. Don't let them do it. It's not okay. Yeah, you can say it. Your First Amendment rights give you the ability to say anything. It is not being a good democratic citizen to dehumanize people, because democracy is rooted in equality. So, enjoy it. Being an American citizen, being a democratic citizen, it is a privilege that most people in the world have never gotten to have and will never have, and enjoy those freedoms. And enjoy the equality that other people have fought to give you. Most of us in this room would not always have been able to be in this room, would not always have been able to cast a vote last week. Enjoy those freedoms. But remember that somebody fought to give you those freedoms, and somebody could take them away in the future. Just because you have those rights and those freedoms and the equality you enjoy now does not mean you will always enjoy it. So be part of the solution. And I'll close with, my husband and I have been rewatching Ted Lasso, just to cheer us up a little bit. And so I'll close with Ted Lasso. In America, you can believe whatever you want to believe. You can believe the moon landing was faked if you want to. You can believe that the moon is made of cheese. You can believe that, you can believe anything you want about the First Amendment or the Second Amendment or the size and scope of government or about taxes or about drugs or whatever. Believe whatever you want. But please, if this were my last lecture, I would ask you to please believe in a couple things. Believe in democracy. If we don't believe in it, it's not going to work. You got to believe in it. You got to believe in the possible. You got to believe that we collectively can make things better the way that other people made things better for us. You got to believe in freedom. And we can define that a lot of different ways and fight about how to define it. But you got to believe in it in order to enjoy it. You got to believe in political equality. for everybody, especially for people you don't like. And you got to believe that we can do this, that we can get together despite all of our differences and like govern ourselves. Democracy is the art of running the circus from the monkey cage, as the saying goes. And that takes a leap of faith, right? It takes a leap of faith to believe that we can do this. And so I would ask you to take that leap of faith with me and believe. Thank you.